Well, this is excellent. So let's begin. My name is Sydney Winston. Today is the 29th of January, 2022. And it's just gone. My name is Sydney Winston. Midnight. Actually, it's almost 1 o'clock in the morning, but I am one of the first people. On the 29th of January, my apologies, it's the 29th of January. I'm one of the first people to stream on a day like today. Lucky me. A warm welcome to the show to everybody watching. How are you? I'm still getting organized here. All right. I think I'm pretty organized. So today, in this episode, which hopefully won't be too long, unless people join in the hangout later on. Well, not too far from now. But I want to talk about the supernatural. Does the supernatural actually exist? Can the supernatural actually exist? How can anyone possibly know about a supernatural outside of a natural? How can anyone possibly know? For sure. You can guess. It's a lousy guess, but you can guess. So what I want to do is start the discussion on the supernatural. How are we going to do this? Well, I think what we're going to do is I'm going to rely on sources, secular sources, for the argument against supernaturalism, and I will rely on the Christian point of view for the argument for supernaturalism. The argument against supernaturalism, I'm going to draw on a source called onlysky.media, which is a secular forum for columnists, and I will be concentrating on the view of supernatural from my point of view, from the atheist point of view. It's not written by me, but written by professional writers. And so I was thinking the best thing to do first is probably, let's listen to the Christian view of supernaturalism. The reason why supernaturalism or the supernatural actually exists. This is according to the Christians. I'm using the argument for supernaturalism by Brett Keane. So let's hear it.
Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Brett Keane from God TV Radio, and today I am going to prove to you that the entire universe was created by a supernatural force. We all have heard the explanation of the singularity, the Big Bang, and how the universe accelerated outward. By doing so, when the universe came into being, this is what created time and nature itself. It is impossible to have a naturalistic explanation for the Big Bang because nature itself did not exist until the acceleration it followed. Science claims that matter cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be transformed. According to scientists, matter came into being upon the acceleration of the universe. Therefore, matter itself, by their own words, by science itself, admits that matter was created. The definition of supernatural is as followed: a manifestation or event attributed to some force beyond scientific understanding of the laws of nature. Paranormal, psychic, magic, magical, occult, mystic, mystical, superhuman, supernormal. And of course there's more. That is the definition. I will state it one more time. Attributed to some force beyond scientific understanding or even the laws of nature. The laws of nature did not exist until the universe came into being. There was no nature, there was no time, there's nothing to mathematically, coherently equate the Big Bang or singularity to. That is why we will never have a naturalistic explanation, and it will forever remain supernatural. Because nature, time, and matter itself did not exist until following that of the singularity Big Bang, acceleration of the universe, there's only one explanation. There's only one alternative. The force behind the universe would not be bound or constricted or limited to nature and time itself, because those things didn't even exist until following that of the Big Bang singularity. Therefore, it would be timeless, eternal, everlasting. It would be ageless. It would not have to be concerned with entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, where it says all things break down and become disorder. This force would be perfect. It would be something that cannot be affected by nature itself nor time. This force has the ability to create. This force has so much power that it can create a universe that is 200 billion light years across and still to go, because the universe is expanding and accelerating as we speak. Ladies and gentlemen, there is only one force like that has ever been talked about since the history of mankind. There's only one single force that exists like this in the minds and hearts of all men, women, and children, and that force has been known since the beginning as God.
Okay, so there you go. That's the Christian argument for the supernatural. Brett Keane made many mistakes in his argument. They are quite obvious. There's not even any reason to go into them. But I will say one thing that he got wrong. He says that scientists say that all matter and time and space and etc. started at the Big Bang. He's wrong there. We have to, if there was a Big Bang, and you Brett and Christians out there, if you actually accept that the Big Bang actually happened, whether caused by God or not, you have to accept that in order for there to be a Big Bang, there has to be something to go bang, right? So you have to accept that there was matter, there was energy, and there was gravity at the time, or just prior, certainly, to the actual Big Bang. Otherwise, there would be nothing to go bang. There'd be no matter. So matter and gravity are present when the matter and gravity are present at the Big Bang. So to say that there was no matter at the Big Bang is a fallacy. It's wrong. It's just wrong. It's incorrect. It's false. Christians say this all the time. This is their first mistake in trying to explain the existence of the supernatural. So now, what I would like to do is turn to Now I'm going to turn to a publication, a new publication, where the secular writers hang out. They used to hang out on Patheos. Well, that's all gone. Now they hang out on Only Sky. Only Sky, you say? What the fuck is Only Sky? Well, Only Sky you'll find on the web at onlysky.media. It's very new. It just started this month, January of 2022, and it's essentially the outlet for secular writers, secular thinkers. Like I say, it used to be Patheos, the non-religion, but Patheos has become more pro-religion, and so everybody's leaving Patheos. They're coming to Only Sky. And I'm going to start reading to you from Only Sky. More reasons why God is always the worst answer. I'll read these to you before we get into the supernatural. Okay, I'm assuming that that reasons 1 to 4 have already been published, because it starts at number 5. Right. So let's see. Number 5 of why God is always the worst answer. Number 5, it ignores the trend. Hold on a sec. I have a bot that I need to remove. I am watching the chat, so please say hello. And I'll get to ya. All right, so it ignores the trend. Number 5. Supernatural explanations are superseded by natural ones. Hold on, I'm going to get my camera right. Never the other way around. So supernatural explanations are superseded by natural ones, never the other way around. Lightning used to be of heavenly origin, but now we have a natural explanation. Plague, famine, drought, accidents, death, and so on used to have supernatural explanations, but these have been replaced. Might we suddenly discover strong evidence that argues that some religious claims are true? Maybe, but that's not the way to bet. Yeah, indeed. Just how poorly does the God did it explanation do against natural explanations? Might a natural explanation be so ridiculous that God did it becomes plausible? Perhaps. But since we have no prior examples of supernatural explanations being universally accepted, unlike a natural explanation like the germ theory of disease, this hypothetical explanation would have to be pretty ridiculous to be worse than anything from the supernatural category, which has never produced a single universally accepted explanation. One Christian proposed this deliberately ridiculous explanation of Jesus. Time-traveling insurance salesman led by a clone of Elvis go back in time to manufacture the idea of Jesus to get the concept of act of God into insurance law. Have we finally found an explanation so ridiculous that the supernatural Jesus story is finally plausible by comparison? Nope. Number 6. It ignores the default position. Well, yeah. Hundreds or thousands of religions are practiced today, and many more were practiced in humanity's long history. True. People invent things like ghosts, fairies, and superstitions. We understand how urban legends, conspiracy theories, and even traditions develop and take hold, and people make up religions by the thousands. Ghosts don't exist, urban legends are false, and so are made up religions. Given any particular supernatural belief, the default position is that it is yet one more false belief by a mind that is susceptible to lots of false beliefs. The Christian claims are a bold rejection of this default position. That doesn't mean that Christianity is false, but it does mean that it has the burden of proof. I've also explored Christian attempts to shirk their burden of proof. That's a link to another article. I'll get to the author in a moment. He also wrote an article called Why Christianity Looks Invented. Who wrote this? Bob Seidensticker. I want to follow Bob. Bob Seidensticker. You'll find Bob on Only Sky. OnlySky.media. All right, number 7. God catching uses evidence inconsistently. We can manage the Christian metaphorically throwing out a net to catch fish, where the fish are truths about supernatural claims, and the net is the evidence criteria. The trick is being consistent when evaluating the evidence. When the Christian seeks evidence for God, the holes in the net are small. The evidence criteria become flexible, and any little clue is evidence. Personal feelings, good luck, and happy coincidences, the dismissal of inconvenient science by a Christian non-scientist, apologists' assurances that the Bible, but not other ancient religious texts, is real history, and so on. But when evaluating other religions' supernatural claims, the holes are big, and only the most compelling evidence could count. The Christian becomes skeptical and stringently applies the evidence criteria. Suddenly, they sound like an atheist and reject all but the most compelling evidence. This looks like just another man-made religion. These religious books are too old and unreliable. The supernatural claims are laughable, and so on. This is a biased approach to the evidence. Sure, all of us are at least a little biased in how we sort through the evidence, tending to keep what confirms our beliefs and reject what challenges them, but we must do our best to evaluate evidence objectively. Number 8, and the final one in this article by Bob Seidensticker. Claiming that a God exists who created the entire universe is about as extraordinary a claim as possible. Such a claim needs extraordinary evidence. Not only must Christians make do with hand-waving similar to other religions' believers, Christians often are reduced to protesting against the demand for extraordinary evidence. Many apologetic discussions devolve into, quote, well, you can't prove God doesn't exist, unquote. That's correct, but that never was the goal. All we can try to do is follow the evidence, and the evidence, does not lead to God. This is written by Bob Seidensticker. After graduating from MIT, Bob Seidensticker designed digital hardware and is a co-contributor to 14 software patents. For more than a decade, he has explored the debate between Christianity, ... Go to onlysky.media to find out. anymore. Right, so that was the first article. I got 3 in total. But before we carry on, I think it's time to visit. What are we going to visit? We're going to visit the chat room. Now watch this. This is embarrassing. So this is the chat room, and I have one chat in there, and it's a bot. Such is life at 1 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. One thing I haven't checked is if there's actually anyone watching. Well, no, there is. Okay, let's carry on. So, evangelism is a topic that we often use for entertainment purposes. For example, we have our Mr. Batmans, and we have our Darth Dawkinses and all his minions, and we have Nephilim Free. We got lots of clowns. We're not short of clowns. So the next article is by Captain Cassidy. I'm going to follow Captain Cassidy, also on Only Sky. And he writes, there's nothing supernatural about evangelism. No, there's nothing supernatural about evangelism. Evangelism? Yeah, I'll say it that way. Hi, and welcome back. Lately, we've been talking about personal evangelism, the person-to-person variety that is usually conducted by rank-and-file lay people in church. Lately, Christian leaders have been pushing the flocks harder and harder to engage in evangelism. Unfortunately, nothing those leaders teach about is really true, especially the stuff they teach about its actual nature. Today, let me show you the lies Christian leaders teach about the nature of evangelism and why they need the flocks to see evangelism as supernatural and divine instead of completely natural. Note, evangelism is at heart a sales process. Evangelists sell only one product, and it's not belief in a magical invisible wizard in the sky. Evangelists seek to induce belief only so they can sell their own group as the only valid way to meet the demands of that belief. End of note. Evangelism as a supernatural process. Fundagelicals interested in evangelism have always seen this task as divine in nature rather than natural and earthly. They insist that Jesus himself commands them to do it. Then Jesus magically captures Mark's attention for the salespeople. And finally, he ensures via invisible strong-arming of his victims' minds that his followers' efforts result in a finalized sale. So in every way, evangelism becomes, for its fundagelical sales force, completely divine. Their actual involvement thusly shrinks away to circumstantial and coincidental at best. When I was a Christian, this is exactly what happened about. This is exactly what I believed about evangelism. My leaders taught that Jesus could and would use literally anybody to make sales. All his pet humans had to do was open their mouths, just like in Jeremiah chapter 1 verse 9, Exodus chapter 4 verse 15, and Isaiah chapter 6 verse 7. If we did that, then Jesus would magically provide us with the best words to say in that situation. The belief illustrated. We thought that this false belief operated just like that old Rose is Rose comic strip where Pasquale frets about ordering his own food in a restaurant. He wants a hot fudge sundae, but he's nervous about talking to the waitress who is a stranger to him. Luckily, he has a guardian angel with a very hands-on attitude. In the strip, the angel has told Pasquale that whenever he's scared to speak, he only needs to open his mouth and the angel will take over. So Pasquale does exactly as he's told. He opens his mouth and OMG, yes indeed, his angel speaks through him. Unfortunately, the angel orders a steamed vegetable platter instead of a sundae because that was a better choice nutritionally. To heck with what the child wanted. Ha! Ha! I bet every single fundagelical or ex-fundagelical reading that strip recognizes the teachings lurking behind the strip's little story. We all lived the same reality, especially regarding evangelism. As you'll see shortly, we had very important reasons for believing that personal evangelism was divine in nature. Those reasons had nothing whatsoever to do with making sales. In fact, it's a completely counterproductive belief in every single way. But it's so important to fundagelical culture that its leaders will never, ever change it. Evangelism, teachings in the wild. I'm not exaggerating when I talk about this teaching. Here's some quotes from the wild that emphasize the supposedly divine nature of evangelism. From a crew or CRU evangelist, quote, I stood trembling behind my closed door and prayed, Lord, I don't know how to do this. If you really want me to introduce these ladies to Jesus today, please make it supernaturally natural. Unquote. From Ministry Magazine, quote, a healthy biblical theology will guide the pastor/evangelist to a complete dependence on God for the mysterious work of conversion that he alone can accomplish. Because evangelism is God-ordained and God-inspired, it must be understood as a successful enterprise in and of itself. God has not left evangelism to chance. End quote. From Pastor Mentor, quote, your church can be used by God to lead people into a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. If you believe Jesus, prayer is the first and most important piece in your evangelism system because it is the Lord who calls people to himself. Unquote. From Tim Challies' blog, quote, the one who plants and the one who waters are together nothing. It is God who gives the increase. It is God who determines who will respond to the message and who will not. Unquote. On and on it goes. In a very real sense, in this bizarro world, Jesus always does the real work. His salespeople only function as his temporarily chosen vessels. Sure, anybody could fulfill that function, but Jesus wants them to do it this time. Lucky them. Comforting failed salespeople. There's a method to these leaders' dishonesty about evangelism. There's a reason why they teach this false idea about the nature of evangelism. In fact, there are two reasons. First and foremost, when something's supernatural, there's not actually any way to teach successful processes for it, or even evaluate current processes. Nobody has to learn how to make sales. It's all just Jesus' power anyway. If the results are totally out of their hands, then literally nothing they can learn or say or do impacts these results. So why bother learning sales techniques that work? Why bother evaluating and comparing different processes if it all comes down to divine whims. Anyway, it's not only pointless to learn valid sales techniques, but such progress detracts them from the ZOMG miracle. I have no idea what that means. Of a finalized sale. Sales mean more if the salespeople have no idea what they're doing and if sales happen despite their behavior. Just one moment. Bot alert. Of course, as I've said, sales have never really happened to any great degree with person-to-person evangelism, but fundagelicals' folklore is filled with stories along these lines. I myself heard them constantly, since many Christians' testimonies back then involved inept salespeople, and they still do. Such stories are meant to thrill and amuse listeners, and also to remind them of what a wonder-working God they worship. He can score sales from any approach. Whoa, dude. But these stories are also meant to embolden listeners to go and do likewise. Thus, a more timid fundagelical who really doesn't do well in a confrontational sales model can feel emboldened to try to make sales anyway. Their God might just decide to speak through them and score a sale despite their lack of confidence and their inadequate training. I'm going to skip the rest of this particular article to go to the next one. But let's talk a little bit about Captain Cassidy. Captain Cassidy is Cassidy McGillicuddy, a Gen Xer and ex-Pentecostal. The title is metaphorical. She writes about the intersection of psychology, belief, popular culture, science, etc. You can find Captain Cassidy on Only Sky, onlysky.media. That'll take you to Captain Cassidy. Back to the chats, and we see that we have 2 bots have entered the chat and no real people as of yet. Where are the real people? That's okay. We'll just carry on without the real people. Oops. I didn't want that to happen. All right, what I do want to do is go to the next and final article about the supernatural. Here it is. Okay, it's called Supernatural Beliefs, the $1 trillion fraud. $1 trillion fraud, supernatural beliefs. This I want to read fully. This is by James A. Hart. And I'm going to follow James A. Hart. Alrighty. So, the article is titled Supernatural Beliefs, the $1 trillion Fraud by James A. Hart. Think of the amazing number of supernatural beliefs held by people. Gods, goddesses, devils, demons, angels, heavens, hells, purgatories, limbos, miracles, prophecies, visions, auras, saviors, virgin births, immaculate conceptions, resurrections, bodily ascensions, faith healings, exorcisms, salvation, redemption, messages from the dead, voices from Atlantis, omens, magic, clairvoyance, spirit signals, divine visitations, incarnations, reincarnations, second comings, judgment days, astrology, horoscopes, psychic phenomena, extrasensory perception, telekinesis, voodoo, fairies, leprechauns, werewolves, vampires, zombies, witches, warlocks, ghosts, wraiths, poltergeists, doppelgammers, incubi, succubi, palmistry, tarot cards, Ouija boards, levitation, out-of-body travel, magical transport to UFOs, Elvis on a flying saucer, invisible Lemurians in Mount Shasta, Thetans from a dying planet, etc., etc. That's about 60 varieties, and you can probably think of others I overlooked. All these magical beliefs are basically alike. They're so tangible, there's no tangible evidence for any of them. You can't test supernatural claims, you're expected to swallow them by blind faith. The only proof for them is that they were revealed by some prophet, guru, astrologer, shaman, mullah, mystic, swami, psychic, soothsayer, or channeler. Well, considering the human brain's vaunted power of logic, you'd think that people everywhere would reject magical assertions that can't be verified. But the opposite is true. Billions of people embrace them. Almost all of humanity prays to invisible spirits and envisions a mystical realm. Virtually every leader invokes the deities. Supernaturalism pervades our whole species in one form or another. Around the planet, varying from culture to culture, the phenomenon is nearly universal. It consumes billions of person hours and trillions of dollars. Millions of prayers to unseen beings are uttered every day, and millions of rituals performed. This extravaganza requires a vast array of priests and personnel, and a vast array of buildings and facilities. The cost is astronomical. Americans alone give $70 billion a year to churches, more than the national budgets of many countries. Other supernatural investment is enormous. For example, Americans spend $300 million a year on psychic hotlines. In this mighty ocean of spirituality, only a few rebels dare to ask, what if it's all untrue? What if no spirit realm exists? And the whole enterprise is a fantasy? What if people don't live after death? What if thousands of years of kneeling, praying, worshipping, sacrificing, fighting holy wars, torturing heretics and the like was and continues to be a monumental waste? What if the emperor has no clothes? What if the whole supernatural spectrum and its huge army of practitioners constitute a trillion-dollar fraud? Well, we skeptics are fairly certain that the entire mystical realm is a delusion, a global self-deception. But few Americans agree with us. We are a tiny fringe, so outnumbered that it's almost forbidden to voice our view. No television network or mainstream magazine or other mass medium would dare say that religion isn't divine. And when we say it, hardly anyone listens. To make matters worse, we're losing ground in some intellectual circles. In the past, we could feel confident that the most intelligent, educated thinkers regarded miracle claims as bogus. But this former fact of life is being undercut by the trend called postmodernism. In academia these days, many say that the truths of supernatural religion are just as valid as the truths of science or the truths of history, learned through centuries of human experience. Postmodernists proclaim that all knowledge is subjective, merely the perceptions of the perceiver. Well, I don't want to bog down in deep extremes of philosophy in the abstruse question of whether it's possible to know anything beyond cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Descartes showed that all I can know with certainty is that my mind exists and is receiving impressions, and it's only an assumption that the impressions are a valid picture of external reality. Leaving that enigma aside and looking at human reality as we live it, I think we can conclude that postmodernism is baloney. In our everyday practical world, some things are real and others are bogus. Some things are trustworthy and, and others aren't. Some obviously work and some obviously fail. We can see it through simple common sense. If your child develops pneumonia, you don't hire a witch doctor to shake rattles and chant incantations. You seek antibiotics and the best professional care. You don't consider one treatment as good as the other. In other words, you believe in science, not supernaturalism, because your intelligence has taught you that one is real and the other is quacko. Or if your car breaks down, you don't pray for the engine to be healed. You seek a skilled mechanic and a well-equipped garage. You know that prayer is no more effective than rattle shaking, while the intelligent technology of motor repair really works most of the time. In fact, we could declare a universal law that is borne out in daily life time after time after time. Science works and prayer fails. Reason and logic bring enormous benefits to humanity, but supernaturalism brings little of value and often brings terrible harm. Consider some examples. Aztec priests cut out people's hearts to appease an invisible feathered serpent and other magical gods. They also strangled children so that tears would satisfy the rain god. And they decapitated maidens, skinned them, and danced in their skins to please gods. Most sources say the Aztecs sacrificed about 20,000 victims a year. Yet today everyone knows that the invisible feathered serpents and other Aztec gods didn't exist. So this ghastly slaughter was a total waste. Hundreds of thousands of lives destroyed for nothing. What benefit did this supernatural religion bring to the world? Bring to the people? Would postmodernists say that Aztec beliefs were just as valid as our modern belief in science and democracy and human rights? Thugs of India strangled people for Kali, the goddess of destruction. Their theology held that Brahma the creator was making new lives faster than Shiva the destroyer could end them. So Shiva's wife Kali wanted her followers to hunt unsuspecting humans and strangle them with sashes. Again, estimates say the thugs were killing about 20,000 victims a year until British rulers stamped out the practice. Today, millions of Hindus still worship Kali, and occasional rumors of human sacrifice still surface. But most of the world doubts that there's an invisible Kali who desires strangulations. So you see, supernatural beliefs cause horrible bloodshed for nothing. They're not just as valid as the rational scientific outlook. Next, think of the multitudes of heretics and witches who were tortured and killed by the Holy Inquisition, all in the name of the compassionate Jesus. Think of philosopher Giordano Bruno, who was burned at the stake for saying the universe is infinite. Think of physician Michael Servetus, who discovered that blood circulates from the heart to the lungs. He was burned in Calvinist Geneva for doubting the Trinity. All that torture and burning was declared to be God's will, but nobody today actually believes it was. Even the church, if cornered, must concede that the claim of a divine mandate was false. How many postmodernists would contend that the truth proclaimed by the inquisitors was genuine? No. I think intelligent people who look at the world objectively perceive that some things are real and others are unreal. To me, all supernaturalism belongs in the latter category. It's the $1 trillion fraud. So, where does that leave us? Is humanity doomed to be forever mired in voodoo? Maybe not. When I was a young thinker and knew everything, it was obvious to me that mysticism would soon vanish, because bright, educated, science-minded people would see that it's all a fantasy. As usual, I was wrong. In my lifetime, there has been an upsurge in fundamentalism, Pentecostalism, and other sorts of magic. Fundamentalist Muslims became the deadliest terrorists. Fundamentalist Jews are wrecking democracy in Israel. Fundamentalist Christians want to restore Puritanism in America. Fundamentalist Hindus destroy mosques and battle fundamentalist Sikhs in India. And yet, in spite of this soaring irrationalism, part of me still thinks my original hunch was right. Perhaps it's just wishful thinking, but I predict that scientific agnosticism will blossom among intelligent people, especially in Western cultures. In fact, it's happening now, insidiously. America evolves constantly in subtle increments that aren't noticed until you look back. Remember the 1950s? Blacks were forbidden to enter white schools, restaurants, theaters, hotels, neighborhoods, pools, and most workplaces. Gays were imprisoned for sodomy. Unmarried couples were arrested on fornication charges. Looking at the equivalent of a Playboy magazine or R-rated movie could land you in jail, ditto, for buying a lottery ticket or a cocktail. Jews were banned from some clubs and subdivisions. Divorce and unwed pregnancy were hush-hush disgraces. It was a crime in some states to sell condoms, even to married couples. Today, that era seems as unreal as the Civil War. It slipped away, but most of us were too busy to see it leaving. If we didn't notice these profound cultural shifts, what others are creeping up on us now, undetected in the daily hubbub? Nobody can answer with certainty. Social tides are hard to chart. Not even pundits saw that Soviet communism was about to evaporate. Well, I think America is going through another unseen transformation, the retreat of supernatural religion, at least among the educated class. Although the Christian coalition still can marshal millions of evangelicals for Republican candidates and the Promise Keepers can fill arenas, I think the brightest Americans steadily are losing confidence in magic. Hardly anyone today, as I said, trusts prayer to cure diseases. In fact, American society is so unanimous on this point that prayer only parents who, so, excuse me. In fact, American society is so unanimous on this point that prayer only parents who let their children die without medical care are prosecuted. Politicians still invoke deities loudly, but in truth, they don't really expect heaven to touch down and bless America. Government programs are based on pure humanism, people striving to improve daily life without supernatural aid. Even sophisticated ministers doubt the gods, although they usually hide their disbelief in pious-sounding words. Episcopal Bishop John Spong of New Jersey wrote a book, Why Christianity Must Change or Die, belittling the notion that God is a supernatural being who rules the universe from on high. Since there's no magical God, he concludes, there likewise is no divine, resurrected, invisible Redeemer. Another book, The Meaning of Jesus, contrasts the views of two Episcopal thinkers. One of them, Ohio State University professor Marcus Borg, says Jesus wasn't divine, wasn't born of a virgin, wasn't resurrected, and isn't coming again. Of course, all this is camouflaged in a smoke screen of churchy euphemisms. Think of it. Cautiously, evasively, some religious leaders are saying that the whole basis of Christianity is untrue. I'm sure that many intelligent preachers secretly share their view, but don't dare say so. Slowly, subtly, America is becoming like Europe, where supernatural religion has faded to a tiny fringe. One indicator of US change is the disappearance since the 1950s of all those puritanical taboos rooted in church thou shalt nots. Another indicator is the traumatic shrinkage. Another indicator is the traumatic shrinkage of mainline Protestantism, once the domain of the elite. I think the decline of those tall steeple churches means that educated people have less faith in gods and heavens. The Western world is turning more rational, more scientific. Education is dispelling superstition. America's Catholic hierarchy still denounces the sin of birth control, but members don't listen. Evangelists still rant against sex, but most Americans no longer think sex is dirty. Fundamentalists still call gays evil, but society at large is more tolerant. Preachers proclaim God's will on these topics, but it rings hollow. Don't get me wrong, religion and supernaturalism still are mighty. Around 40 million Americans worship each Sunday. No politician could be elected if he admitted atheism. New Age mysticism is blooming, but insidiously, subconsciously, the scientific outlook is winning among the educated, I think. Yale scholar Stephen Carter wrote a book titled The Culture of Disbelief, protesting that U.S. trendsetters no longer take religion seriously. Carter called it a sign of moral decay, but I call it a sign of a rising mental honesty. Yeah. America is evolving in a healthy direction. Despite all the pious posturing, if you look carefully through the daily tumult, you can see supernaturalism dying. Final thought. As society turns more secular, some people give less thought to religion and don't ask whether it's true or phony. But this evades a major issue of honesty. Steve Allen put it well in one of his books. I do not understand those who take little or no interest in the subject of religion. If religion embodies a truth, it certainly is the most important truth of human existence. If it is largely error, then it is one of monumentally tragic proportions and should be vigorously opposed. While I hold the latter view and try to oppose the trillion-dollar fraud, I think honesty requires it. Although we questioners are greatly outnumbered, history is moving in our direction. Wise people are abandoning the supernatural. Someday, maybe, most of the educated class will follow. If it happens, we skeptics of today may be seen like the abolitionists who said slavery was wrong, or the feminists who sought equality for women. They were just a fringe, often ridiculed, but they eventually prevailed over the majority. Now, the whole world looks back and knows they were right. I hope that this is our destiny. Hart is editor emeritus of West Virginia's largest newspaper, the Charleston Gazette-Mail, and a senior editor of Free Inquiry magazine. This article originally appeared in Church and State, July 1990. So there you go. All right, let's switch over to the Let's switch over to the chat. All right, so you can see that there's no one in the chat. There never has even been one person in the chat. No one's watching. So I guess as usual, I will I'll keep this room open. I'll keep the chat room open, the hangout open for a while. Then you can join. What I'll do is look, I don't think I've done this before, but I should put the at least put the link into the side chat, even though no one's watching. Just makes no sense, but I'm gonna do it anyway. Pin it on top. Okay, so maybe what I'll do is I will leave the yeah, I tell you what I'll do. This is going to be a new thing. I'm going to leave the side chat. I'm going to leave the whole hangout open. I'll stream it live for a while, see if anybody comes in. And if nobody comes in, then nobody comes in. But I'll give it some time. All right. But it wouldn't be fair for me to leave you with dead air while we wait for people to come in. So what I'll do is I'm going to go and find something to listen to. Okay. It will probably be something Christian related, and hopefully very interesting. Very interesting. And there was actually something I was following earlier. Let's see if I can find it. Let's see if I can find it. Ah, yes. We got some choices here. I'm gonna have you listen to this explanation of supernatural. We actually have some choices in terms of supernatural stuff. I'm gonna find something. So we have Catholic mystical theology. And we have the incomprehensible and the supernatural. How about we go with that one? The incomprehensible and the supernatural. So let's go find it. All right, I think I found it. Excuse me. Excuse me. I didn't have time to mute anything. Oh my god. All right, so we do have something to listen to. I do believe we will have something to listen to. Give me a second and I will I'm going to find the place where it's actually at. And I will present for you one moment. I'm just setting it up. Okay, I'm setting it up, all right? Just give me a second. Just got to get some audio for you guys.
The doctrine that we will look at in this lecture, that we will see the development of in this lecture, is the doctrine of the incomprehensibility of God. Remember when we were talking about the Trinity, how we mentioned that there's this eternal begetting of the Son by the Father. The Son is eternally begotten of the Father. He originates from the Father, but it's not a process in time. Right? It's a form of origination where Christ comes into being, or rather the eternal Son comes into being, and yet there was never a time when he was not. Right? He comes into being, yet there was never once when he was not. That's a very hard concept to wrap your mind around, and the Church Fathers after Nicaea ended up insisting that it is in fact incomprehensible. It's an incomprehensible divine begetting of the Son by the Father. That becomes the nucleus of the distinctively Christian doctrine of the incomprehensibility of God. There's an incomprehensible divine begetting at the heart of the divine Trinity, which is the Christian view of God. So at the very heart of God is incomprehensibility, a mystery beyond our understanding. And what we're going to do in this lecture is trace that concept as it goes its way in two different directions and then gets mixed up in a way in the Middle Ages. The two different directions are east and west. Remember, we've been talking about how the Roman Empire has an eastern and a western half. Think of the Roman Empire situated around the Mediterranean. The eastern half, including Turkey in the north and Egypt in the south and Israel, is Greek-speaking. And that half of the Roman Empire becomes the theological homeland of Eastern Orthodoxy. The Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox churches trace their theological tradition back to the eastern half of the Roman Empire. It's Greek-speaking half. And we talk about the Greek church fathers, people like Athanasius and Gregory of Nazianzen, who spoke Greek. The Nicene Creed was worked on in Greek in the eastern half of the empire. Then there's the western half of the Roman Empire, the part where they speak Latin. That includes Italy, Spain, North Africa, the part of North Africa that includes, say, Algeria and Tunisia, where Augustine worked. And that part of the Roman Empire is the theological homeland of Catholicism and Protestantism, what's called the Western Church. Both Protestants and Catholics derive their theological tradition from this Latin half of the Roman Empire. Now, of course, there's interaction between the two, but there's some important differences in the tradition. The most important being that the Latin Church, the Western Church, has Augustine. They have Augustine, as it were, in their bloodstream, and the Eastern Church doesn't. The Eastern Church has not been deeply influenced by Augustine. The Western Church has been profoundly influenced by Augustine. And that is part of our story in this lecture. Let's go back to that notion of the incomprehensibility of the divine Trinity. The incomprehensibility of God is not a uniquely Christian doctrine. The Trinity is, of course, but the incomprehensibility of God is a philosophical concept which was developed at some length by a great pagan Neoplatonist named Plotinus, a 3rd century pagan Neoplatonist who was a very important figure on the horizon for Christian thinkers as they're working through the way they think about God. Plotinus had thought of the divine. He doesn't actually have a concept of a personal God. but he thinks of the divine, we could say, in three parts, or three principles, really. In one of his treatises, he even speaks of three divine hypostases, using a term that Trinitarian Christians will pay attention to. Three divine principles or hypostases in a descending order. There's a kind of hierarchy here. First of all is the One, he calls it, then the mind, meaning the divine mind, and then the soul, meaning the world soul, or the soul that is the life of all things.
Yeah, I want to recognize Hemperacer in the chat. How you doing? Welcome. If you want to join in the Hangout, there is a link at the top, and if you want to join using a phone, the number's on the screen. We are talking about the supernatural, fact or fiction.
So that all souls have a kind of participation in this divine soul. We're not going to be able to talk much about this divine soul that is at the life of all things. Interesting concept, but it's not a Christian concept. The divine mind, this middle concept, has more of an influence in Christian thinking. It's a deeply Platonist concept. It's related to this notion of intelligibility that we talked about when we discussed Platonism in an earlier lecture. Remember, you're working on the Pythagorean theorem, and then you're not getting it, but you're figuring it out, and then all of a sudden you say, aha, now I see it. That is the activity of the divine mind. It's not a process. The divine mind never figures stuff out, never learns, never grows. That's what we do when we're figuring stuff out. The divine mind is simply that, aha, now I see it. An eternal contemplating of, there's the truth. So the divine mind is full of ideas, it turns out, but that's a technical term in Platonist philosophy. In the history of Western philosophy, no one has ideas except God, except the divine mind, until the 16th century, or rather the 17th century with René Descartes. Prior to that point, the only mind that has ideas is the divine mind, or God, because it's actually a technical term in Platonist philosophy up to that point. It's an eternal, intelligible form or essence, the kind of thing we referred to in that earlier lecture, an eternal form or essence or truth, like, say, the Pythagorean theorem, or like the eternal truth about justice or eternal beauty. And to know these ideas is not to figure them out, but to see them. Aha, now I see it. When you have that aha experience, it's no longer a process. It's just a seeing. You just see it. You just get it. It's a moment in which time touches eternity. And the divine mind is all aha, all seeing the truth. It's pure intellect perceiving intelligible truth. But that's not the highest level. The highest level is where it all begins, the One. The divine mind has many ideas. The One does not. The One has no manyness, no parts. It is simple in the technical sense of having no parts. Think of it as like a geometrical point. A point in geometry has no dimensions, no parts, no length, no width, no depth. But all of geometry, as it were, is generated by this simple, dimensionless point. So that's just a metaphor, but that's how the concept of the One works in Neoplatonism and in Plotinus. The One has no differentiation, no parts, and yet it's the source of all the manyness, including all of geometry, all of logic, all of ethics, indeed, justice, truth, beauty. All that stuff is sort of generated by the One. And indeed, the divine mind is eternally generated by the One. And this is exactly the same vocabulary used in Nicaea, in the Nicene Creed, to talk about the Son being eternally generated or begotten by the Father. The Church Fathers noticed this. The problem is that in Plotinus, the One, when it generates the mind, generates something less than itself. The divine mind is less than the One, precisely because it's generated. The One has no source. The mind has its source in something above it. And it was very natural for Platonists to think about this in this way, this kind of hierarchy. What is generated is lower than what generates it. The source is higher than the thing that comes from it. That's precisely what the Nicene doctrine of the Trinity denied and said, no, the Son is not lower than the Father. Even though his source is the Father, he's equal with the Father. There's no hierarchy here. There's none of this descending scale of being. Whereas in Plotinus, the Neoplatonist, there is this descending scale of being. The mind is less than the one. The intelligible is less than the incomprehensible. Because the simple one is, in fact, incomprehensible. Because it has no manyness, no ideas, no structure, it can't be understood. The mind is precisely all about understanding. The divine mind is understanding, pure understanding, eternal understanding. But the one is above understanding. The one is above intelligibility. The one is above form and idea and essence. The one is a simple and incomprehensible thing above all other things, and the source of all other things. Now, you can see that this is going to pose a very interesting challenge to anybody who wants to think about an eternal God. And the Christian theologians in the Nicene tradition certainly did. So, one of the most important questions is, when you think of God as a Christian, when you think of the Trinity, are you thinking of an incomprehensible one or a divine mind? Which is it? Because they do seem to be different concepts of the divine. That's a challenge that the Eastern tradition gave a definite answer to. The Eastern theological tradition, from which we get Eastern Orthodoxy, Greek Orthodoxy, Russian Orthodoxy, very clearly identified the Nicene Trinity, the God of the Christians, with the incomprehensible one of Plotinus. Because, after all, the eternal generation of the Son is incomprehensible. The Trinity itself is incomprehensible. That is to say, it's above intelligibility, above understanding, not below it, but above it. It also means that the Trinity is simple. This is interesting. Simple is a technical term. It means it has no parts. You may remember when I discussed the doctrine of the Trinity in our lecture on that topic, I kept emphasizing God does not have parts. God is simple. The Trinity is simple. It has no parts. The Father is God, the Son is God, the Holy Spirit is God, but the Father is not part of God. So in the Eastern Orthodox tradition, the Trinity is the simple, incomprehensible one. The great theologian who worked this idea out at the most depth is a Greek theologian, a 5th century Greek-speaking theologian named Dionysius. Nowadays he's called Pseudo-Dionysius because he identified himself with a 1st century Dionysius that no one thinks he actually is a 1st century Dionysius. I won't go into those details. He's a Pseudo-Dionysius to modern scholars. He's Dionysius simply to the Eastern Orthodox. In the West, he came to be named Denis, and we get the name Denis from him. Dionysius worked out the notion of the Trinity, the Christian Nicene Trinity, as a simple, incomprehensible one, no parts, and above intelligibility, above all understanding. It's like saying, we have to understand, you see, when you say that God is incomprehensible, above understanding, you're not saying that he's beneath understanding. It's like understanding is like seeing something in the light. And then there's what you can't see because it's too dark. And then there's something else. There's the divine darkness of the incomprehensible God who is dark because he is too bright. Imagine trying to look right straight at the sun, too bright to see, and it darkens your eyesight. You're dazzled. Your eyes are blinded. So there's a divine darkness, says Dionysius, which is like the dazzling brightness of the sun. It is above intelligibility, above light, above understanding, because there's too much to understand. It is, it's like the sun, which is too visible to understand, too visible to see, I should say. Right? Think of the sun as too visible to see. Well, God is too intelligible to be understood, and that's what incomprehensibility amounts to for Dionysius. An incomprehensibility that is like a brightness too bright to see. Well, what do you do to talk about an incomprehensible God? Dionysius picks up on a theme that was already developed in the Eastern Church, and he takes it further, a theme of what's called apophasis or apophatic theology. It comes from a Greek term meaning negation or denial. Dionysius says, when you want to talk about God, the best thing to do most of the time is to say what he is not. God is not material. God is not passible. God is not changeable. God is not in time. You can say a lot of things about what God is not, because God is not like anything else. God is like nothing in the world. So you can look at all sorts of things in the world that you do understand, and even you can look at all sorts of intelligible truths and say, God is not that. So there's a theology of denial, of saying what God is not, called apophatic theology in the Greek Orthodox tradition. The West actually picked up some of this, and in Latin they called it the via negativa, the negative way. Same idea. You describe God by saying what he is not. But Dionysius is actually a very subtle thinker, and he realizes that that's not all you want to say. You do want to say something affirmative about God, and after all, even the negations, the denials, are not an adequate way of talking about God. We have no adequate way of talking about an incomprehensible God. So, yes, we should negate things about God, right? He's not in time. He does not change. He is not limited. He's infinite. Notice how many of the abstract terms we use for God are actually negations. Infinite, impassible, changeless, eternal, really, which means not in time.
Crazy
You can
stuff.
actually find a whole lot of the crucial metaphysical attributes of God really are negations. But, says Dionysius,
Hemp racer. You think about how the Romans fooled the Christians into joining their pagan cult? What does that mean? Pagans fooled the Christians. Well, didn't the Christians replace the Christian cult, I should say, replace the pagan cults that of the Romans? I mean, it's the same crap, but I was under the impression that the one God concept of Christianity replaced all the pagan thinking at the time. They merged. Yeah, they merged. All right. Just that the Christians didn't accept the pagan part of it. Remember how Christians martyred themselves by not performing pagan rituals like lighting incense. They would refuse to light the incense because it's a pagan ritual, because and the reason they did that was because Jesus was their only Lord and whatnot, and so they refused to recognize other gods, as it were, and then they would be, ultimately executed in one form or another. Christians are fucked up.
the negations also are not adequate. So if affirmations, negations, neither of them are adequate. Both of them are necessary. So we can both make affirmations and negations. And so Dionysius is actually famous for another treatise that he writes called On the Divine Names, which explains crucial terms used to describe God. By the way, names here is another word for nouns. It's a slightly misleading title, slightly misleading translation. On divine names means on divine nouns, like good or goodness, truth, beauty, justice. All of these are nouns that can be used to name or describe God inadequately, because God is not like any goodness or beauty or justice that we know in our experience, but he is the source of all goodness and beauty and justice, just like that one is the source of all the manyness of geometry. So if you think of goodness, beauty, and justice as flowing from this source which is above all goodness, beauty, and justice, but not a negation, not simply a negation, right? Like the sun that's too bright to see, like the good that is too good to be a good that we can recognize and understand. That sort of affirmation. God is the hyper good, we could say, the hyper beauty, the hyper justice. And in fact, Dionysius will say God is hyper essence, or hyperousios is the Greek term. Hyper essence gets translated into Latin as super essence, because not only is he above intelligibility, he's above essence, right? Because the intelligible essences in the mind of God in Plotinus, the intelligible essences are the only essences that are actually the highest essences there are intelligible essences. And being above intelligibility means also being above essence. You can actually say in Pseudo-Dionysius, God is above being, right? He's more than being. He's hyper being. He's hyper essential, super essential. He's the good beyond goodness, the being beyond being, and he's also beyond understanding. And let me mention, on the affirmative side of it again, you get this notion of goodness. God is the good, very Platonic way of speaking of God. Christians like it. God is the supreme good. Dionysius will say God is the good that diffuses itself. Lovely phrase. The self-diffusing good. Again, like the sun, which diffuses light. The sun which is above light because it's too bright to see, but it sheds light everywhere. God is the good that sheds good things everywhere, diffuses good things everywhere, so that the whole universe is good. We mentioned that with Augustine. Dionysius fully agrees. The universe is good because it all is an outflowing from the goodness of God. Now that's Dionysius. He's an Eastern Orthodox theologian. The Eastern Orthodox theologians love him. He became influential in the West beginning in the early Middle Ages, became very influential in the High Middle Ages in the 12th and 13th centuries. But he's rather different from Augustine, who's so influential in the West. And the West ends up having to combine the two in a peculiar way. So let me now contrast Dionysius, or Denis as the West calls him, with Augustine, who is the most influential theologian in the Western Church. Augustine, I think, conceives of God as intelligible. I should mention, I'm an Augustine scholar. That's my specialty. I did a course on Augustine, philosopher and saint for the teaching company many moons ago. And I have an unusual view of Augustine on this point, a controversial view at least. So you should be aware that there's a controversy brewing about this, and I'm on one side of it. What I think is that the best way to understand Augustine's view of God is to realize that Augustine thinks God is intelligible, that God can be seen by the mind's eye. It's as if when our diseased mind's eye is healed by grace, we can look straight at the sun and say, ah, yes, I see it now. We can look at the sun and not be dazzled. Augustine does talk a lot about the experience of being dazzled by the beauty and the truth of God, but he always attributes it to the failure of our mind's eye to be healthy and strong. Our mind's eye is like an eye, our intellect is like an eye designed to see the light of the sun. So our intellect is like an eye designed to see the light of divine truth. So of course we like looking straight at God. That's our happiness, is to look straight at the light of truth and beauty, the divine truth and beauty and goodness, and say, ah, that's what I've been longing for all my life. That road that I've been traveling, that road of love, and I finally found the truth that I've been looking for, and I can look right at it. And that's what happiness is, to joy in the truth, says Augustine. So Augustine has a picture of God that fits more the picture of the divine mind in Plotinus than the picture of the one. Although, interestingly, Augustine really knows his Plotinus and knows his Neo-paganism, or rather, pagan Neoplatonism. He knows the difference between pagan Neoplatonism and Christianity. And he does, in fact, when he talks about the Trinity, he'll use the language of the divine one, the incomprehensible and simple one. But he really doesn't have such a strong notion of incomprehensibility as Pseudo-Dionysius. For instance, he will say God is incomprehensible. He'll use that language. But he actually interprets it rather differently from Dionysius. Just like when he uses the metaphor of dazzlement. He's not saying, oh, no, there's no created eye that can look at the sun. Right? You can't look at the sun. No, he's saying if your eye is healthy, it can look at the sun. If your intellect, if your soul is healthy, it can grasp God. But with the eye of your soul unhealthy, you can't look at God without being dazzled. So you've got this unhealthy eye, but when the eye of the soul is healed by grace, and love brings you along that road to your heavenly home with God, you will, in fact, sort of by the very nature of your intellect, be able to see God. So Augustine, I think, is conceiving of our happiness and our goal in a rather different way from Dionysius. We're going to be able to see God with our mind's eye. That's what our mind's eye is made for. That's what our intellect is made for, is to see the truth. It is natural to us, we might say, to see God. And that's something that is unique to Augustine. It's fairly clear that the rest of the tradition doesn't want to say that. It's not natural to us to see God, right? It's like the sun that no natural eye can look at. So we've got a problem here that's going to have to be solved. But let me go on to say a little bit about Augustine's view of incomprehensibility. He does use the word, as I mentioned, but he doesn't interpret it as this dazzlement, as if God is inherently beyond our vision. Rather, he says this. Here's a sermon that he preaches, his 117th sermon. We got a lot of his sermons. He says this: God belongs to the mind. He is to be understood. That is, he is to be an object of intellect. The word understanding here is related to the word intellect in Latin. Intelligendus est. God pertains to the mind. He is to be understood by the intellect, just as bodies pertain to the eyes. They are to be seen by the eyes. But do you suppose you comprehend a body with your eyes? Not at all. Comprehend is a Latin term, it turns out, which means to grasp all around. You know, a prehensile tail in a monkey is a grasping tail. To comprehend is to grasp all around. I can grasp a cup all around by putting my hands on both sides, and that's comprehending it in the literal sense. But can I see it from all sides? No. Whatever side I look at, there's a backside that I can't see. I cannot comprehend it with my sight. That's what Augustine means by saying that even visible objects are incomprehensible to sight. I can't see it all the way around. Likewise, he says in this sermon, whatever way you look at it, you're not looking at the whole thing. Same thing with God. You look at God, and indeed, God is there to be understood by the mind's eye. But you can't comprehend all of God. You can't grasp all of God with your intellectual vision. Well, sure, of course you can't grasp all of God with intellectual vision. I can't even grasp all of a cup with my literal vision. I can only look at one side of it. That's a very weak concept of incomprehensibility by comparison to Dionysius' concept. So, now we've got a problem. Fast forward into the Middle Ages in the West. The West is deeply influenced by Augustine. The West believes that it is our happiness to see God, just like Augustine taught. But on the other hand, the West has also inherited the theology of Pseudo-Dionysius, who was translated into Latin in the Middle Ages and became very influential. So what are you going to do if you're a medieval theologian in, say, the 13th century, like Thomas Aquinas, the greatest of all the medieval theologians, and you think that Augustine is right about our happiness? Happiness consists in seeing God with our mind's eye. That's the ultimate goal of life. On the other hand, you also believe with Dionysius that no created being can ever see the essence of God. The essence of God is beyond comprehension for any created intellect. How are you going to have happiness by seeing with your mind's eye an incomprehensible God? How are you going to put those two pictures together? That's the problem that Western medieval theologians had to face. And it's crucial because it's about happiness. And as you recall, happiness is the concept that gives you an account of the meaning of life. What is our life for? It's for happiness. It's for seeing God. But we can't see God without being dazzled. No created being can see God without being dazzled, says Dionysius. Augustine says we can, but that view gets dropped. The notion that it's natural for us to see God with our mind's eye is essentially rejected by both East and West. The notion that Augustine actually thinks we can, by nature, see God is a view of Augustine which I advocate is probably true about Augustine, but that's the controversial point in my own Augustine scholarship. So, let's go back to Thomas Aquinas, 13th century. How to say that we have a beatific vision of God, it's called, a vision of God that makes us happy. It's called beatific because it means gives us beatitude. Beatific is Latin for to give us happiness or beatitude. So that's what we need, is this vision of God that will make us happy, beatific vision. And yet he's incomprehensible. How do you combine this? Well, here's what Thomas Aquinas says. Like Dionysius, Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century says that seeing God is beyond the natural capacity of any created being. Even the angels, by the way, cannot by nature see or understand God. God is incomprehensible even to the angels. Yet it is not beyond the capacity of a mind that is elevated by supernatural grace, says Thomas. This is a new concept of grace, a concept of grace which elevates human nature, and that's why it's called supernatural. It elevates it above itself so that it can see what no natural capacity is able to see. Grace, in this new sense, this new Thomistic or medieval medieval Catholic sense. It's not in Augustine, I don't think. Grace in this new sense doesn't just help us to love God, doesn't just heal us so that our mind's eyes are strengthened to see God. No, it elevates us so that we can do what we cannot by nature do. That's what's supernatural about it. And it's a gift that sort of takes residence in our soul. Thomas will call it a habit. We'll talk about that notion a bit later. It's a habit in the sense that it forms our soul. It becomes a deep part of ourselves. Supernatural grace, it turns out, becomes, or is in fact, a created thing. Supernatural grace is a created formation of our soul which lifts it up above its natural ability. So it's supernatural, but it's also created. That's an interesting combination of things. It's supernatural, but it's not divine, it's created. It's a created capacity, or rather created habit, formation of our soul, almost like a skill. A habit is like a skill in Aristotelian theology, Aristotelian philosophy, and Thomas is an Aristotelian. Think of how when you develop a habit like the ability to play the violin, that forms your heart and soul so you can do this well. Well, what supernatural grace does is it forms our heart and soul in this supernatural but created way, right? We're still just creatures here, so that our souls can see what is beyond their nature to see. It lifts up our nature so that it's still created nature, but beyond its natural inborn capacity, so that it has this supernatural ability to look right at the very essence of God, and instead of being dazzled, to find in that super brightness the beatitude, the happiness, the ultimate goal of human life. So, Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, the greatest of all the medieval Catholic theologians and the most important theologian of the Roman Catholic Church, works on this new concept of grace, a grace that doesn't just heal or help the soul to love God, but elevates it. Not just healing and helping, but elevating, lifting us up above nature in this supernatural gift to see God and to find our happiness in seeing an incomprehensible God. The concept of the supernatural is Thomas's solution to the question, how do you combine Dionysius on the one hand and Augustine on the other? The West in the 13th century, the Middle Ages, inherits these two theologians, and Thomas Aquinas, who's a very deep thinker, finds a way to combine the two. He's actually very good at taking different strands of the tradition and seeing how they can fit together. And that's what he's doing with this new concept of supernatural grace, which becomes a very, very important concept in Roman Catholic theology, which we will come back to in later lectures on Roman Catholic theology. But this is where it begins. This is the medieval development of really the patristic concept of the incomprehensibility of God. More medieval developments are on their way, developing ideas that go back to the Church Fathers and the New Testament. We're in the Middle Ages, more Middle Ages to come.
That does not sound too convincing to me. I don't think that there ever was I don't think that there ever was a supernatural. To say that God is incomprehensible and humans can never understand God is a little bit laughable, because God is if incomprehensible, then how can you say that this God actually exists? That seems to be incoherent. The flying spaghetti monster is incomprehensible. How is that any different from God is incomprehensible? To me, it seems to make no difference. Regarding any other videos, I don't have anything else. This was pretty much my presentation. The idea was to generate a conversation. and perhaps a conversation will be generated, but it doesn't seem to be happening right now. Could be the time zone thing, could be the Sydney Winston derangement syndrome that Christians seem to have acquired. And I'm actually kind of proud of that, to be honest with you. I like it. I like it. My question is, how's my audio? How's my audio? Is that any better? Because my mixer didn't look like it was picking it up right. Anyway. Hempracer says it's trying to quelch any kind of thinking or questioning. That is so 100% spot on. You nailed it. Do not think. Thinking is for atheists. And you don't want to be an atheist, do you? That's kind of the way they talk. Bloody idiots. I am at a loss for words, quite frankly, right now. I would normally just yak on, just cackle on, until somebody decided to, they couldn't take enough of me just rambling on my own, so they would come in and interrupt my rambling. But, yep. Oh, yeah. You know what they do, Embracer? They make you feel guilty. They try and make you, they gaslight you. They confuse you. They make you feel guilty. It's 100% dangerous and 100% unethical and 100% supported by your federal government, no matter what country you're in, except if you're in Japan. Japan seems to be. I saw a. I was in. I should have bookmarked it, but I can find it. There's a video clip on YouTube titled "Why Japan Hates Religion." At least I think it's on YouTube. It might actually have been on BBC website. Maybe, well, one of the two. I should go and watch that and maybe we do a review on it. Why does Japan hate religion? And I think we could try and did you see that? I lost my connection. Did you notice? Yeah. Right. So, short of sitting here talking to myself, I am going to wish you a very good night. For me, it is 2:25 a.m. That is after midnight, and I am on the Pacific coast of Western, the western part of Canada, on the west coast, and I'm going to wish you all good night. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you, Hemperacer, for participating in the chat. I really appreciate every one of you all the time. Please like, please subscribe, and please share with your comments. I thank you so much.